Right, well, there we go. We are streaming live to YouTube. Hello to everyone who has dialed in, is either watching this live. If you are with us live, please do hook up and you can get in touch with us through the chat on YouTube. Please do that. Fire some questions. I'll be going through those later on. But first, to our esteemed panel, thank you all very much indeed for giving up valuable time, just, 27 hours or so after Sunak delivered his spring statement. Sorry about that, just dealing with some technical problems. So to our esteemed panel, we have with us today Dr. Craig Berry, Interim Director at the Future Economies Research Centre and Head of the Manchester Centre for Economic Policy. Dr. Nicola Headlam, Chief Economist and Head of the Public Sector for Red Flag Alert. Dr. Nick O'Donovan, Senior Lecturer in Political Economy, also in Future Economies Research Centre and our resident tax guru. You've got me, I'm going to be chairing this, but I'll chip in with some of my views as we go through. I'm Head of Economic Data and Analytics at the Future Economies Research Centre, and from what anyone at MMU has to describe as down the road, Professor Andy Westwood, Professor of Government Practice at the University of Manchester. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. So yesterday, Sunak, a very brief speech, which is nice. I'm a huge, huge fan of budget and fiscal statements being shorter rather than longer. It was short, and that means there's probably quite a lot missing as well, but we'll pick up on what was missing later. But Nicola, from the private sector, can I go to you first and say, of what there was in there, what did you make of it?
It was brilliant. As I am the chief economist within a data and tech company, it was the best budget speech we could have had, under which there was going to be allowances that roll forward from the last budget on, very personally for Red Flag Alert, on tech, on pure maths, and on data. So essentially that just makes all our products 20% cheaper to our customers. If anybody would like to buy some data, we can buy it. We're selling like hotcakes. But actually for the tech sector, it was a great budget, no problem. Those measures we'd been advised, because obviously we're gearing up to sell aggressively with 20% off as people can use it against capital receipts. We've been advised that would probably only stick next year, but quite the opposite, they're here to stay. So that is helping to continue to inflate the tech bubble. So thank you very much, Chancellor. Lovely.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Over to one of my colleagues at NAU, Craig Berry, Head of Economic Policy here. What are your thoughts on what the Chancellor gave us yesterday?
Well, I know we're going to come on to talk about what he didn't give us a little bit later. I mean, there is so much that can be said about a statement which was so comparatively short. I think one thing that I'd highlight is just the sort of quite chaotic way in which economic policy is now made in the UK, and the fuel duty cut is a great example of this. You introduce, was it now 10 years ago, the fuel duty escalator, which is never, a policy which they always pretend is real, but it's never been implemented. Usually that's you get to announce that at a budget or a fiscal statement that actually we're gonna postpone the fuel duty escalator to help everybody, the cost of living. Now we've gone from not escalating it to actually cutting it in a way that will have virtually no impact, because the cut will be overridden by the rising price of fuel. I think has it already been overridden, or will be very soon.
It certainly only took it back to the price about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So it's a fairly meaningless throwaway policy. So it's hard to get, from that perspective, it's hard to get too worked up about it. But in terms of what it tells us about how economic policy is made, especially when it relates to sort of climate change, a huge challenge that we're facing as a country, as a species, doesn't tell us anything good. It's very very short termist, hard to understand. The rationale seems to have arisen purely to try and grab one day's good headlines, but even failed on that front. So, and that, I mean, I would say that was kind of indicative of this statement and recent budgets.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say sort of you're trying to grab the temporary headlines. I mean, most people say it's pretty good news. You don't expect the budget to fall apart until the day after. But this was looking like it was falling apart while he was still on his feet in terms of some of the media reaction, and even the pro-Tory press. This morning there were some pretty unpleasant front pages from him. The Spectator and the Telegraph have turned in the past few months against aspects of this administration, but this morning seemed that they've even lost the Express, which is a sort of a pretty startling set of affairs.
Well, I mean, one relevant thing there is, of course, pensions, and one of my favourite subjects that not choosing to reconsider the uprating of state pension, using September's inflation figures, which are now wildly inconsistent with reality and will be for some time, was probably a mistake if you want to manage the Tory press. On that, I mean, I have a degree of sympathy because it costs a huge amount of money, which to have uprated pensions by 7-8%. So I think that was in that way, maybe the budget wasn't quite as political as it might have been, because they did make a tough choice on that. I personally don't think they made the right decision, but at least they weren't just chasing after the headlines when that decision was made.
Yeah. So Andy, you were in Treasury, so I don't know if this disconnected thinking is any of your legacy since you were there. But what do you make of what you did yesterday?
Well, it's very kind of you to think I've got any kind of legacy in any department, but especially not the Treasury. I thought it's worth saying, I guess, that this is of the two big set piece events during the year. This is always the smaller one. So the timing's changed over the last sort of few years, and the budget originally at this time of year kind of is now in the autumn. So on that basis, it was always going to be, well, we could have expected it to be a smaller one with less measures, in line with pre-budget reports back in kind of Gordon Brown's day, or more recently the sort of spring statements that we saw yesterday. But then at the same time, Rishi Sunak in the run up to it was out there, as chancellors do these days, kind of giving away the themes and and the big theme was that we're going to go out and tackle the cost of living, and we're going to help people, and we're going to stand by them. And so I think by his own sort of trailing of the budget, it fell fairly short, even though. You might not have expected it to say quite as much as he was promising for it beforehand. But I agree. I mean, I agree kind of with what's been said already, in that I think he expected there to be a better reception for things like the 5p off fuel. I think he expected there to be much better reception for the 1 pence off income tax at the end of the Parliament. I mean, we can all obviously set our diaries for when the general election's going to be, so that's not unhelpful. First 2 weeks in May, blank it out now. But yeah, that support didn't really materialise. And I think one of the funniest things I read yesterday, I think, was George Parker at the FT when the map came out of how to get from the current tax arrangements to the income tax cut in 2024. George Parker described as a flowchart.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And of course, we've had the tax strategy. It's a while since we had a tax roadmap. I remember it coming out, and Osborne and Cameron had a go in the coalition period. So Nick, your general views, but kind of from your point of view as a tax, you're the tax guru here. What do you make of what actually came out yesterday?
So obviously, tax was going to be a very important part of this statement, because from Sunak's perspective, I think he wants to tackle the cost of living crisis primarily not through spending more, but through taxing less. That appeals to his backbenchers, that appeals to his own self-declared ideology as well. So the idea was, let's have tax cuts to address the cost of living crisis. But these tax cuts have left us in a rather confused place in terms of tax policy. So we had this announcement recently about the national insurance increase that is coming in just in a few weeks' time. The national insurance increase that is there to pay for more investment in health and social care, supposedly justified by reference to that spending. Now we're seeing that increase partially rolled back, significantly rolled back by dint of increasing the national insurance threshold at the same time broadly. So we're seeing that rolled back, but we're not seeing any corresponding change in health and social care payment. But we're seeing a partial policy reversal, and one that in fairness does give back more to lower earners. Doesn't necessarily give back to all lower income households as a whole, for reasons we'll come on to, but for lower earners does give back more than it takes away. So we can see there's some strategy there, but again, we're talking relatively small amounts for the average household. And similarly, fuel duty, it's at 5p off, but we've seen 30, 40p increases in the price of fuel in recent weeks. So again, using the tax system here to kind of offset things, but actually it's quite obvious, and I think it's been quite obvious to a lot of people in wider society, in Sunak's own party, in the press, including the right-wing press, that actually, compared to the scale of the problems, this is relatively small beer. And then you have finally this rabbit out of the hat, as chancellors are wont to do, of the 1p cut in income tax, which is coming down the road, which again, I mean, it's income tax and national insurance, they're very similar taxes, apart from national insurance is just a tax on work, whereas income tax is a tax on work and dividends and pensions and property income. So we're seeing this 1.25 point increase in one tax, and then and that's coming in a couple of weeks, and then in a couple of years we're going to have a 1 point decrease in a very similar tax. So it all seems rather odd from a tax policy perspective.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that was my kind of takeaway from how all this interacts. I mean, certainly, I was one of those, I guess some of you were too, sort of being quizzed on the media about 15 minutes after he sat down. So, how does all this add up? And it's like, whoa, this is like, we need a day or two to try and unpick how the different interactions in all of this stuff are going to go through. Thankfully, we've got bodies like the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Rest Foundation who didn't sleep last night and have done a lot of that stuff for us. And actually, the outcome is how it all mixes. Is it basically makes all, to within any sort of significance, it makes almost no difference for anybody over the full term. And actually, whatever difference it makes, the higher than expected inflation will just erode all of it anyway. In which case, kind of the question then comes back is kind of like, well, why deliver this then? If all of these statements are, individually punchy, but don't actually add up to anything, then sort of what was the point? So it's an interesting one. Lots in there, but not necessarily with lots of output, not even necessarily political output. But I think to a more interesting question, so I mean, you all touched on it, and Andy too, we weren't expecting this to be a big statement. Rishi had been downplaying this for a few months, saying this is just an update of the forecasts. But then he gave us lots of headlines, which don't sum to much. But what might have we expected to have seen that wasn't there? And I'm going to go back to you, Nicola, first. What was missing?
I don't know. Everybody's just so negative. If everybody worked in little tech firms, it would be fine. The point is,
more and more of the
not
country
many
does.
people do. A lot of people work in the public sector for whom there was absolutely bugger all. A lot of people, for whatever reason, are reliant on the benefit system for whom there was absolutely bugger all. And I think I said before we came on, when I was, trying to warm up my voice, I just don't think that Rishi knows that he can do anything about those things. Somebody's not really explained to him what a chancellor's for. As you say, these are really marginal and sort of self-erasing corrections that he's making. Again, an activist chancellor with a clear political economy and a clear sense of what they're there to do, does things. And that's why when, again, people say it's there's a political, it's just a waste of everybody's time if you're not dealing with the real economy from the dispatch box. And, again, I'm obviously being slightly nice for tech, but, we all live in the real economy, and the 600,000 people kind of moving from almost managing to not managing, that's the Chancellor's job to address that. How you address it, the point is that he just doesn't. It's just like it's optional, and I just don't understand how that's the case.
Over to our political economist, Craig. Is the Chancellor missing a political economy completely?
I do wonder if he's slightly more politically savvy than we are at the moment, giving him credit for, in the sense that this wasn't intended to be a big statement, and the big impact on the cost of living hasn't really happened yet. I mean, a lot of people listening to this, I'm sure, will say, "You what?" Of course it has, but I mean, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And it's interesting that he has built up a bit of a cliche, but the war chest, the fiscal war chest, with higher tax revenues than were expected, and there could have been a bit more of a spending bonanza at this statement. It could have afforded to spend a bit more. No, it's possible that he is hanging back for the autumn, when people will have had a few months of paying extraordinarily high costs for their domestic energy, and at that point, he will hope that the slightly anomalous situation where the Treasury is taking in quite high tax revenues with a fairly sluggish economy. I think that's because people are just outspending a lot more money than they really have, because of the sort of more freedom that we have from COVID, or we feel that we have at the moment. And he'll hope that lasts, and may be in a position to spend some more of that in the autumn, when people are really feeling the living standard squeeze. So it's possible there is more sort of political wisdom there than we're quite giving him credit for at the moment. More cynically, I would say that the people that would benefit from that, the people on benefits, the public sector workers, he knows are not the people that he needs in his support base, either to become Conservative leader or to help the Conservative Party win the next general election. They probably do have a get out the vote strategy, because the polls are so tight, rather than win over the centre ground strategy. So it makes sense, I guess, from that perspective, that he is less concerned about the votes that they're probably never going to win anyway.
Yeah, I think the idea of whether this isn't nakedly political, I mean, it's actually how I described it. I was interviewed last night at the Beeb, and it said, a lot of the stuff that came through for me was kind of nakedly political, just because it doesn't make a great deal of economic sense, and so that he's trying to play to a base. Do you think that works, Andy? Do you think this is, on the basis like Craig's comments, does this actually help shore up their position in terms of the next election?
I don't know about that far. I mean, so whether it's the bigger fiscal event or the smaller one, it's always a massively symbolic political opportunity, and and most chancellors can see that. And I think he did try to make this a kind of as political a budget as he could, and to take advantage of that personally as well as on behalf of the party. So I think going into it, he probably thought, look, I've got two things I've got to do here. I've got to look like I'm making an effort on the cost of living, and acknowledging that inflation is going through the roof, and peaking at 8.7% or expecting it to is a lot, as Craig says, a lot of that pain is still to be felt. And I think the other half was to continue what I think he has been doing, which is sort of setting out his stall as a potential leader. And so in terms of the sort of my political vision content, you could see a direct line from the story he was telling in the Mays lecture a couple of weeks ago. And some of that content made its way straight into the spring statement speech. So all the stuff about capital, people, ideas, he kept repeating, and actually some quite interesting content there around again the tax system through tax credits for R&D and skills, and that might be worth unpacking a little bit later. But but I think he felt his task was to continue to sort of set out that stall. This is what I'm about politically. This is what you can kind of count on me for as a politician and as a chancellor. And so I think that was clearly an objective he wanted to sort of set out, as well as, you know, you can rely on me at the moment in this particular crisis. I'm not sure it quite came off, but I think that was the intention. And obviously you can trust me in my heart. I'm a tax cutting chancellor. Obviously that sort of links straight across to the 2024 commitment, which he obviously hoped was going to be the thing that kind of held both the economic headlines and the political headlines.
Yeah.
But like I say, I'm not entirely sure either of those came off in the way that he would have hoped.
Yeah, and of course, you know, is he the tax cutting chancellor? And so we've had the wonks at the IFS have done all the numbers, and basically they tell us this is a net fiscal raise in terms of the government. This is not a tax cutting budget at all. Quite the opposite. There's some net benefits to those sort of lower down on earnings briefly, but those kind of things will wash through. Nick, how does all this kind of, you know, we're going to come on to sort of some of the policies generally, but kind of how does all this work from a tax point of view? You say it's a huge, again, you know, he said this is a minor statement, it's just going to be a minor update, but actually we've seen some pretty chunky changes to the tax system, and a lot of these things kind of cut across each other. So your political economy hat as well, you know, does he come out of this looking like a tax cutting chancellor?
Well, I think the interesting thing is he might, or at least I think he hoped he would come out of this looking like a tax cutting chancellor, because if you read certain of the tables that he's published, then they simply contain a list of policy announcements that show quite a lot of numbers going down. So there is certainly a lot of tax cuts announced, both with the NICS threshold change, the fuel duty change, very tiny amount of VAT cut. But what's really interesting is what's going on, if you like, off table, off spreadsheet, which excites us tax people no end. We love a good spreadsheet. So what's happening there is that because of the inflation in the wider economy that we're seeing, because of the very, very high rates of inflation that we're seeing, actually a lot of the important thresholds in the tax system, so the threshold at which you start paying higher rates of income tax, the threshold even though it's been uprated a bit, which you start paying higher levels of NICS. Those are all set in nominal terms. Those are set in cash terms. Whereas actually in real terms, because of the inflation, numbers are going up in the wider economy. So he's banking quite a lot of cash through what we like to call fiscal drag. So this phenomenon whereby you keep your tax thresholds the same, but because there's inflation in the wider economy, we see tax revenues start to increase. So that's, if you like, it's sort of something that Gordon Brown did a lot. He was lambasted at the time for it being a form of stealth taxation, which it is. So Rishi Sunak is trying to do the same thing, and that's where he's getting this big chunk of cash that he may spend in the form of tax cuts or spending increases when it comes to the election time. So just one small sort of observation on the politics of this all. So that's if you like the tax geek side of it, but just on the politics of it all, it is interesting. He is going out there as this tax cutting chancellor, and that does appeal to a certain kind of conservative. But it's also really important to note the way that conservative coalition has shifted, particularly around the 2019 election. So while this does seem like quite a conventional conservative strategy from the Conservative playbook, actually in terms of the Conservative Party of the last 2 and a bit years, it's a little anomalous and perhaps doesn't sit too well, because actually that coalition with those former Red Wall seats does involve actually a lot of people representing places where universal credit is actually quite an important component of household income, or quite an important component of local demand in their particular regional economies. We've seen the Conservative Teesside mayor come out over the last 24 hours saying, actually, this doesn't really do enough for my constituents. So while the strategy is clear, it's not necessarily clear how that pans out in terms of the if you like, the modern Conservative Party, the post-2019.
I think that speaks to Andy's point, which is just because the economics look fishy doesn't mean that the politics aren't fishy too. And there's more red meat required for the kind of, if we're going for the base has moved quite far. If you're going for the red wall, that's moved also. The point is that these things are diverging in almost a demonstrable way, aren't they, from one another and from reality, I would argue, and from the real economy off spreadsheet. That's the bit that doesn't really ring true, is that it doesn't feel like he's established a kind of clear lock on any of those moving parts, I think I would say.
Yeah, so just one comment to pick up then on Nick's, we'll just sort of dwell on the politics and we'll move a bit more into the policy. One of my notes kind of going through everything was, as you said, this return of fiscal drag. It feels like, in a really big way. I mean, the numbers, we were holding these thresholds flat was expected to gain the chance for about 8.5 billion over the rest of this parliament. With the new inflation forecast, that's now 18 billion. So the fiscal drag is huge with the level of inflation. But this is kind of really eroding that big coalition policy 2010-2015 about getting the personal allowances up to minimum wage and up to living wage. So we see another 6.6% rise in living wage kicking in April. That looked pretty hefty when it was set last year. It's now below inflation, but that's coming up. But the tax bases are shrinking if we're going to be freezing them for this long. Is this kind of where Sunak moves away from the Tory party of the 2010s when we start to go in a different direction?
But also, again, maybe sort of the extent to which, in the same week as we see P&O and the replacement mariners on £1.80 an hour. So in a sense, your marginal gains around minimum wage policy rebranded as living wage policy. I mean, that could be 30 quid an hour, but if it's being undercut in the way that it is, I mean, they were saying that the replacements were on £1.80 an hour, £74 a week. That sounds like a 1970s salary, let alone back to a 70s kind of industrial relations. Like, in some ways, I guess that's the slight unreality about it. That filled the papers for days and days, and fair enough, it was covered off in PMQs and all of that. But you're describing an economy in which your minimum wage gain is under inflation. But if there's such obvious ways in which your minimum wage policy is being undermined, it does add to the sense of unreality that, you're kind of cranking the handle more and more, and there are ways around, your main wages policy has been undermined in the most obvious way it could be. And then that somehow doesn't feature as then how you rethink wages policy. You see what I mean?
It's a lack of a coherent strategy about how all of these different things connect, which is exactly what you were talking about earlier. Yeah, it's just it feels like this is sort of very arm's length chancellor management of the very macro scale of the economy, but without any connection to what any of this means in the.
If I can just say one more thing, and then I will be quiet. The last time I was assembled with the august professors was this. I don't know if you've heard of this policy area. It used to be really big. It was called Levelling Up. Remember, like that thing. Like, clearly, Rishi has not been attending the edX subcommittee that Michael Gove has been convening, because Not a word, not one word. And also not the real things, so levelling up as that policy brand, but nothing on regional policy, nothing on infrastructure, nothing squared. Like, how can that be the flagship policy of the government?
Yeah, so I think you've just caused me to completely rejig my agenda. So let's go there. Let's go on levelling up. So it wasn't entirely empty. So buried in the documents is the round 2 levelling up fund prospectus, to which every single local authority in the country is going, yay, another competitive bid opportunity. I mean, yeah, it's odd. Levelling up is, by the Prime Minister's own rhetoric, the single defining policy agenda of this government, and it's nowhere to be seen. Andy, go on. You'll be going to take the bait.
Well, yeah, I'll take the bait. I mean, I think I can think back to Nicola and I's discussion on levelling up, and I think what was always interesting about the levelling up white paper, and still is interesting about the levelling up white paper, is that a huge amount of economic analysis, mainly from Andy Haldane, lots of which I agreed with. But there was always a very, very big question about how much the Treasury agreed with it, both in detail, but also in terms of driving it forward. And I think kind of the Treasury was the sort of the ghost at the levelling up feast when that white paper came out. And I think to some extent the lack of reference to it in the spring statement sort of confirms that. It also confirms the kind of process bit of that, which is the Treasury know deep down they're the only department that can really, really drive that kind of cross-government stuff. So their reluctance to show their hand suggests that they're also a little bit cynical that the Department for Levelling Up or whoever else, we could have been having this conversation about BEIS and industrial strategy, of course, if we were talking several years ago. But there's also a kind of sense that not only do they not necessarily share the analysis, but they know full well that a department that isn't them isn't going to be able to kind of drive it in the way that those cross-government agendas need to be driven.
Yeah, and you bring nicely on the industrial strategy stuff. So, Craig, of course, you were part of the Industrial Strategy Commission back in the day. That got abolished. I'm sure nothing because of anything you did. But all of this stuff is dropping so fast. So again, someone else reading up for tonight, going through everything. Someone then reminds me, of course, that just under about a year ago, after the industrial strategy was scrapped, we got the plan for growth. Big to tell it. Here we go. This is the replacement. Nobody's mentioned that since it was published.
Since the launch, no.
Yeah, now we've got the levelling up white paper, but frankly, that's kind of gone to ground in the 6 weeks since that dropped. Craig, where's all this going? I mean, is there any drive left for doing the things they keep saying they want to do?
I don't think that the plan for growth was a serious policy program. Just last week, IPPR published some analysis of how many staff are actually employed at the Treasury to deliver. It was half a dozen at most, wasn't it? Compared to the numbers that had been employed in BEIS and across Whitehall to deliver this previously. So I never took that particularly seriously. Whenever Treasury said they're going to take over industrial policy, that what that means. That means we're not going to have industrial policy. But it has moved to regional policy instead. So I think it hasn't entirely been lost within the Whitehall machinery, but the funds to match it are clearly not evident yet. I think it's a difficult one for Rishi Sunak politically. I think the Treasury is doing what the Treasury always does, but I think Rishi Sunak is in a strange position in that I think that he knows that he eventually needs to deliver something on levelling up because of where the Conservative base has gone. But I also think he knows that he is not going to be the primary beneficiary of it if it succeeds, because it's so clearly owned by some of his rivals within cabinet. And interestingly, the voters believe that it's owned by the Labour Party, not the Conservative Party. So the more the Conservatives talk about levelling up, they're just they are lending support to the Labour Party's framing of what government should be for, to some extent. So he's in a real bind. It's something he has to do, but he knows that he won't actually be the one that benefits from doing it, which is not a good position, because that means that just leaves that stalemate, isn't it, for the foreseeable future, which is not good.
I mean,
Go on, Nick. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to add. I mean, in defence of the Treasury and in defence of the Chancellor, I mean, we are criticising them for things that are not present in this. And if you were about to launch an economic strategy, and then there was a geopolitical event somewhere else in your continent that actually threw a lot of your forecasts and plans off, then you may think, actually, let's just shelve this for a little bit and let's put it on the back burner and let's return to it again. So while I think Andy and Craig, Nicola, absolutely right that this may be something that the Chancellor doesn't particularly have an appetite for, I think it is perhaps a bit unfair to say it should have come out yesterday. Now,
you're referring to the Iraq War, right? They stopped doing anything about levelling up around then, and they haven't got back to it. I mean,
well, yeah, but I mean, I think as Andy was saying, you can see the outlines of what the Chancellor possibly thinks levelling up looks like in the May's lecture, and also in the second half of the Spring Statement, and also in the tax plan that was published yesterday. So you can see this outline of levelling up that is focused very much on skills. It's focused, as he said before, on a high skill, high wage economy. This aspiration to level up by ensuring there's skills that will deliver higher productivity on a regional basis and therefore deliver higher wages. That seems to be his version of leveling up. It's a very supply side driven strategy. If I'm feeling a bit critical, it sounds remarkably like what every government has been trying to do since the early 90s. So that may not work, but that does seem to be the, as the Chancellor himself would say, the direction of travel.
Yeah.
Just think it's magical thinking, right? It's magical thinking.
It's magical thinking that hasn't happened yet. So it's magical thinking that we'll hear about.
All right, it's magical and impossible. Yes.
Postponed magical thinking.
No, I agree with what has been said. I mean, I love the fact that Craig is able to say the plan for growth wasn't a serious government document. I mean, what are we supposed to do? Is it not a serious document until it's tattooed on some part of somebody? Do you know what I mean? The gap, the divergence between performative and substantive policy is now so wide that it's an exercise in. It drives you absolutely crazy to try to parse any of it into, anything. And in a sense, when we say it's very macro, it's macro but atheoretical. That's the other bit. How do you explain that to somebody who's like, wow, it's cost me £100 to fill up my car? Like, oh my God, have you saw the price of bread? Like, yes, well, there's fiscal. I mean, it's something massively wrong in a logic chain that gets you to the pump or the shops or the pound in your pocket. You know what I mean? It's so weird.
Is this? I was just going to suggest: is this a point with this distinction between performative and substantive? It might be worth mentioning net zero, but
net zero is that's kind of the first policy bit I was going to come to. I was going to touch it now, but just briefly, Andy, the whole kind of substantive performative politics stuff. You've been around. We together sat on many panels where it feels like we're kind of rehashing, we're going through the industrial strategy stuff again, we need to do something about skills again, we need to do something about regional governance again, and here we still are. As you said, every government has been promising this for eternity, but it never really emerges. Is there kind of something a bit more fundamentally broken?
Certainly. I mean, first of all, I completely agree on the sort of performative versus substantive piece. It's to some extent politics has to be performative. That's not a bad thing, but it's usually helpful if the two bear a bit more of a resemblance to each other. than seems to be the case. And I think the other part of that is that you would hope that there would be some permanence as you go through these things. And as you rightly say, Christian, it's not through a lack of trying that successive governments have failed on, particularly on those kind of supply side things, whether it's skills or regional policy or whatever. I mean, the problem is they try too hard and too regularly and keep changing their minds and the arrangements, even within parties of the same governments of the same stripe. So there's a kind of there's a problem around permanence in any of these arrangements, which are always worth repeating. And I think that point of permanence is quite interesting because, you know, if you're working in the Treasury at the moment as a civil servant and you're approaching the spring statement and you've got this bloke next door who'll chuck money at anything and anybody.
And Prime Minister, I'm guessing.
That is the Prime Minister, yes. And you've got all of these pressures that are building all of the time. So inflation going crazy. You've got, although as Nick's rightly said, you know, that has some benefits as far as the Treasury are concerned. They probably feel quite pleased that the spending review is still intact and hasn't been reopened in any meaningful way either to stick more money down the Ministry of Defence budget or to, you know, really stop a commitment to take 20p off a litre of petrol or halve the price of energy. I mean, these are all the sorts of things you can imagine the Prime Minister promising at the drop of a hat during PMQs. So I suspect there are probably, in that landscape of performance and lack of permanence, I would imagine there's quite a few people in the Treasury thinking, we got away with it. The spending review settlement still exists. We can, you know, we can bank a bit more cash, if only for the short term, and we can regroup and think about what's a sensible set of substantive policies for the future. Maybe I'm kind of, you know, overthinking it, but in a world where impermanence is such a problem, I would imagine there's a few of them that are quite grateful.
Yeah. I think certainly it kind of goes back to the old Brown Blair days, when Blair would just stand up and just announce something. He'd just become so frustrated with Treasury blocking. If I just go on the Sunday news programmes and announce something, then Brown's going to have to do something about it. You do wonder at what point. I mean, certainly the PM on the breakfast shows this morning was sounding very much along the lines of, we know this isn't enough, we'll come back. You know, it's like you're managing to undermine your Chancellor in 24 hours. So it's a pretty bold position. Okay,
It's a great siege mentality of anybody in the Treasury. You know, we're the only people that care about whether government can spend what it can spend and stopping people spending too much of it. So, you know, there's that strong orthodoxy, which is fair enough.
Yeah, it's what they've always done and it's what they're often criticised for. All right, let's swing to policy then. So we talk about permanence of things. So one of the other big things on this government's agenda has been net zero. And getting involved in the last round of the COP agreements. So what do we make of all this fuel duty cutting then? Because I mean, from my initial take is, well, frankly, as people have said, the rate of fuel is going up faster than this. Has only taken about 2 weeks of the last rises off. So it actually makes, yes, those people who drive regularly will certainly feel a benefit, no question about that. It's not a terribly progressive way of doing stuff. So we know those who, people often forget, only half of people in cities own cars. Only about 2/3 of the poor even own cars. So, fuel duty is a regressive cut. It goes to people with the biggest cars who drive the most, who are broadly the wealthy. I was kind of thinking, what's this in the green, in terms of permanence of the green agenda? So I guess two aspects. Permanence of the policy. So, Sunak said, and it's there in the budget documents, this is a 12-month cut. So what are the chances of the Chancellor facing the headlines in 12 months' time of Chancellor puts 5p on petrol duty? How long will this actually work as a temporary tax? And secondly, how does this work in terms of the green agenda and the signalling around all of that? I was taken by a rather nice article in the New Statesman yesterday afternoon, who said, if there is a war on motorists, it's pretty clear the motorist is winning at this point. Big tax cut for drivers, but obviously we're seeing public transport fares continuing to rise. How do they knit this together in terms of their brand net zero? Whoever wants that.
I can say something about that quickly. I mean, I think that your own view is encoded in the question, Christian. Yeah, this is not going to be reversed in 12 months, is it? I mean, that's clear because so we just know from experience that chancellors find it very hard to raise fuel duty, even when it's the law, and even when they've probably said they will raise it after a quite a large, not very impactful, but quite a large cut. So I don't think it is going to be raised, and it's going to rise again in 12 months, and that's partly because the conditions in which you might be able to get away with rising it are not going to have changed in 12 months. The public transport infrastructure in most parts of the country is not going to be adequate to seriously be replacing car use short to medium term. So the same dynamic will still apply. Obviously that takes it a little bit back to levelling up, and whether or not there will be some serious investment in those kind of things which would make levelling up more a reality, which would cost more than the fuel duty rising the fuel duty again would raise. So again, I'm not sure that dynamic we can expect to change over the next 12 months. But this climate thing, sorry to sort of point out the obvious, but it's kind of like got a bit of a deadline on it. So it's a really tough one. Like at some point, a future chancellor, Rishi Sunak obviously won't be chancellor forever. At some point, a future chancellor is going to have to make like some really, really hard choices on this stuff, and I don't think that there's an absence of like sort of policy capacity to make those tough choices. It's just the political conditions in which to make them aren't there yet.
Anyone else want to pick up on the green stuff?
No, they're not going to do anything about it. They're not going to do anything about levelling up. They're not going to do anything about net zero. They're not going to do anything about anything.
I'm glad we invited this beacon of optimism.
I started positive. I said, I'm going to make a pile of money and you can all suck it.
Always good. Nick,
I mean, I think
you're breathing in.
Performatively, I think what the Chancellor wanted to do in his speech was say, well, we've got this fuel duty thing, but we've also got this green giveaway on the energy saving materials, a cut in the VAT rate on that. Unfortunately, it's very much another example of the performance substance divergence, in that you look at the figures and it's 2.4 billion next year on the fuel duty giveaway, and less than 50 million on the VAT giveaway. So that's about 50-to-1 kind of ratio between hydrocarbon subsidy versus green subsidy. So something doesn't quite feel right there. Just one thing I would say on fuel duties, which is part of the political problem, and just to pick up on the distributive point that you raised, Christian, is that it is a bit complex because a lot of it is a geographical question. A lot of it is a sort of rural / town without transport infrastructure, and that does cut across the income distribution in unusual ways. So there's been a lot of talk about how this is a regressive giveaway because a lot of the people who are at the very poorest don't have cars, and that is true. But also there are a lot of people in that bottom decile, the very bottom 10% of the income distribution, who do have cars and drive them quite a lot. So it is a very complex question, the question of fuel poverty, driving fuel poverty, that does cut across the income distribution and cuts across the country and cuts across constituencies in ways that don't necessarily flow from this is a single box of poor people at the bottom of the income distribution. And I do think it's important to note that when we talk about it.
Yeah, no, that is good.
I think on net zero, it's clear that there is still a large chunk of the Conservative Party that are still a bit sceptical about this, and that won't have been lost on Rishi Sunak, and chucking a few quid at motorists. It will have been a little bit on his mind that that scepticism about government's role, about how a Conservative government leads it, is kind of growing a bit on the right of his party, and kind of that's causing some quite considerable waves. So I'm sure that aspect of it was something that he was quite happy to kind of just put a statement down on the table and say, look, I see you, I hear you.
Yeah, I think it's kind of on the back of those research groups. We have the European Research Group and then the Northern Research Group and the Levelling Up. And it certainly looks like there might be some kind of carbon CO2 group of Tory MPs on the backbenches who are getting ready to make some noise about that. So thinking about, it's nice actually, Nick sort of talked about, you know, the way things get distributed and policy doesn't always work nicely across those boxes. He chose not to come back to his energy plan. So back in February, he came up with this grant to try and deal with the whopping increase in energy bills we're all going to face in April, taking it up to probably up towards £2,000 a household for year once his first energy cap comes in. He's done that by rebating through council tax, which is frankly, from my point of view, an insane thing to do. I mean, council tax isn't even a fair and reasonable tax to do what it's supposed to do, in the sense it hasn't been revalued in ages. So it's a poor use. It's a poor guide to house price value anyway. It's an incredibly poor use in terms of energy usage, and an even worse guide in terms of your ability to pay.
On the upside, it does scare Tories so much that because they're so scared of it being another poll tax that sometimes they freak. That's the reason it's been left at a 1991 level, because it's too hard to. We talked about this on Twitter, didn't we? I mean, it's so again back to the thing about, does Rishi know all the different moves of the chessboard that he could take? Like, he could do things for the public sector, he could do things for the poor, he could do all kinds of things. But what he knows how to do is get lots of grants out the door for COVID and use local government as a distributing mechanism for that process. So a lot of the analysis of both Sybils and Bibbles, but then also the local component of the stimulus work shows literally remembering that you've got local government that can blow as well as suck, right? And that's what they did. So sending out to your non-domestic ratepayers their £5,000 in their Rishi, branded envelopes was a moment when local government central government actually was quite pleased to have local government, because it meant that actually, rather than all the fraud that happened in Sybils and Bibbles, they were an effective delivery mechanism, right? So he's trying to do the same thing again, but he's using the wrong bit of local government. And again, it's just a question that I don't think he understands. A lot of these mechanisms, the reason that they don't work are because of 40 years of kind of erosion of, the idea that there's a local fiscal or even local financial set of policies is so laughable that it's all, again, it's back to magical thinking. You can get local government to do certain things under certain conditions. So I completely agree. It's the wrong mechanism at the wrong time for the wrong people. And it's a loan. I mean, Christ. But again, it's a reprise of something that people were pleased about in the pandemic.
Yeah. That's it. I think that there is some kind of echoes. But I mean, the world wonders, would he come back and do a bit more on the energy stuff? Now, some of you suggested that, he's building this war chest for the autumn budget, where, by the time we get to autumn, that people are going to have really felt inflation. He said it's trickling through now. The energy bills and the NIC rise will hit with a wallop next month, because of course the NIC threshold doesn't kick in until July, so there is a 3-month overlap where you get both of those. I mean, should he have done more? There was pressure from the left on windfall taxing the energy companies in all this, because amidst the geopolitical and humanitarian, horrendous crisis that we're seeing going on in Ukraine, and the wider kind of reawakening from COVID stuff in energy over the past 6-9 months or so, there are a small number of companies who are making an absolute killing out of the energy prices being where they are. Should he have done more? Would a windfall tax on those guys been appropriate? Nick, I'm going to come to you first.
So it would have been quite easy. We have a North Sea oil tax regime that's just ready to go. We've put the levels up and down over time in response to whether the oil price is going up or down. most recently we've been putting those tax levels down because the oil price has been going down. It would be perfectly sensible to put those up, and not just in a windfall way, in a sort of retrospective way, but in a prospective way until those monies come down. Now, you will have people say, well, that will deter North Sea investment, although to be fair, we haven't seen much North Sea investment despite having put those down. So really, I think North Sea investment is complex and raises questions of stranded assets and overall national and global green strategy, lack thereof, and so there's an understandable investment reluctance to invest in that sector, but it would be a very straightforward thing to do. It would raise money from people who are benefiting disproportionately. It would give money that could be given back to compensate people for higher energy bills. So it does seem, you almost think that if it hadn't been a Labour Party policy that they had been campaigning for, then he would have probably done it if it had been his idea.
You think, Craig, challenges of Labour calling for things that it then by default means the Tories can't implement because they're just, it's the other side of the house.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a consideration, but they have a proud record of stealing Labour policies over recent years. So I think that probably wouldn't have stopped them stealing this one. I think it would have been popular, and it sort of asked more questions about our economy and who's responsible for paying tax in what circumstances, and they could have got on the right side of that argument alongside sort of public opinion. So what is the real reason they didn't do it? I think it goes back to the earlier discussion. Like, I'm not sure there would have been any credible plan for what they would have done with the revenues from the windfall tax in the short term to have made any difference to people. So they would have taken a bit of a political hit from the people who don't like windfall taxes and tax in general, and actually created a sort of problem for themselves when the voters start asking, like, well, when is this actually going to start feed through into lower bills or whatever mechanism is chosen? For me, I don't think it was the quick fix policy. So that's what they were looking for at the moment, and I'm sure we'll be in the autumn a quick fix for this, and I don't think it is that.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so we're coming towards the end. So I'm just going to change the direction a bit. We've kind of talked about household distribution and so the tax interactions. For those of you who are desperate to go and find out what all those mean, I'd refer you generally to the Institute for Fiscal Studies stuff, who've done huge amounts today. Broadly, it's kind of level. It's there are some sweet spots around sort of £25,000-30,000 a year. If you're below that, you might be marginally better off from the exchanges, but frankly, inflation will just take all of that away. And obviously, the big thing we talked about earlier, one of the big things that was missing, is there's nothing for people who earn less than 10,000. So either part-time workers on living wage or those in receipt of benefits for the disabled, pensioners. If you're not, this is very much in some ways kind of that typical Tory budget. The giveaways are dealt with through tax rebates to earnings, and there seems to be a reluctance to simply transfer cash. Now, obviously, Rishi was in that kind of mood last year during COVID, and he eat out to help out, but I think he feels a bit bitten by all of that, and so has backed away. Now, one of the things for me that's been talked less about because of kind of the high inflation at the moment, and certainly wasn't addressed in this today, is the impact all this has on public spending. So we've just set the 3-year envelopes with the big 3-year review last October. Those envelopes are all set in cash terms. And so all of the big giveaways, the 4% a year to health over the next for the rest of the Parliament, is now a 3 and a bit % to health. The 2.5 bit that was going to go to education is now very, very close to zero. And all of our public sector bodies have energy bills. They all have salaries to deal with. They're all going to also have to deal with the NIC, the employer side NIC payments. So, I mean, my question really is kind of what does this kind of the wrap up really, what does this mean for the public sector side? This for me isn't being talked about enough. But what I see is a big squeeze on public sector budgets over the next 4 years. Much, the talk last October, was it October he did the autumn statement, was this is one of the most generous spending settlements post 2010. All of a sudden, it looks very, very much less generous than he started. Andy, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, you're absolutely right to flag it up, and you're right to flag it up in the context of the spending review settlements for the rest of the Parliament. I think, I mean, my own feeling is that, I mean, obviously, you're right. Inflation at the rate it's still rising to is going to take an enormous chunk out of that. All I can think of to say very briefly on this is that like many chancellors, I think he'll be relieved that he's lived to fight another day on this. And if the cocktail of things that are kind of creating that high inflation rate over this year begin to slip away, he'll breathe a big sigh of relief. So will lots of bits of the public sector. And you can begin to kind of think, well, how do we adjust for that shock during this particular phase of it? If it doesn't, we're all screwed.
And on that final bit of optimism, Craig, public sector impact. Are we paying enough attention to this? And this has got pensionary impacts and all embedded within it.
I mean, one thing that a few of us have almost said in this discussion, but I don't think anyone's quite said it, that tax is no longer like the dirty word that it used to be. I don't think tax rises are that unpopular anymore. I think it's like you look at sort of survey, social attitudes survey and things like that. People even the conservative base are more prepared to pay more tax, but that's also always in combination with as long as it's invested in public services. Yes, this is going to be a big problem because, and it's deliberate. The choice of national insurance is the same reason Gordon Brown chose national insurance, because there is that sort of emotional link with public services, even if in practice it's pretty arbitrary. So people are going to expect to see rising quality in and availability of public services, NHS, social care primarily. I think it is going to be the big political challenge for the next couple of years that there isn't really a good answer for yet. I'm sorry, I don't have a particularly good answer for your question, therefore, but it's so many people's livelihoods and it's so many people's like daily experience of our society engaging with the public services that it is going to be a huge political issue. There is more that could have been done. I think some of us have already said in this conversation, but I'm not sure Rishi Sunak as Chancellor quite has enough of a sense of what normal people's lives are actually like. We saw the stunt with him, not knowing how to use a credit card in the shop and stuff, which is born of the kind of lifestyle that he has. So he's going to have to start learning very quickly about what it looks like when public sector budgets, public services budgets are squeezed as much as they will be over the next few years, and start coming up with some answers.
Yeah, Nick, we do some teaching together around why we tax and what tax is. It's ultimately there for government services, right? That's the whole point of raising it. So where does he go from here? How does he, how do we manage this big fiscal squeeze that's coming through? It's not necessarily cutting in cash terms, but it is at least actively reducing the amount of money available over the next few years. Has he got any room for manoeuvre?
He has a little bit, but as we talked before, there is that amount that he has banked from those inflationary increases, but the suspicion is he's more likely to use that for tax cuts rather than spending increases. And it does look like, in real terms, we're looking to a return to austerity in the public sector.
Yeah, and kind of a final point to you, Nick, and then I'll come to you, Nicola, is, I mean, one of the things I've sort of made in my notes yesterday as he was saying all this is, one of my concerns here is, I mean, any Western nation for me at the minute, any of the kind of the developed countries who say, I am looking to try and develop some kind of lower tax environment over the next 20, 30 years, is for the birds, right? aging population requires increasing your healthcare, requires additional social care, huge health and education post-COVID stuff to repair, and God only knows where defence budgets go over the next 5-10 years. So it's like, there is no Western society that is going to be actively reducing its tax take as a share of GDP over the next 30 years if it's seriously going to tackle all of these things. But every time we see things like big threshold rises, every time we see things like basic rates of income tax coming down, we're eroding the state's ability to collect tax easily, in the sense that we saw this a lot post 2010. The more you give away on the big headline stuff, you've then got to start doing really odd things to insurance premium tax and things to desperately try and get money in, because 2/3 of government revenue comes in from the three big ones. Is there a kind of a political risk here that this is just, the tax rises that are going to have to come at some point over the next 5 or 10 years are just going to be even harder to make? Nick?
I think there's a challenge for Rishi Sunak, particularly because of his setting out his stall as this tax-cutting chancellor, because of the internal politics of the Conservative Party. But actually, in policy terms, there are plenty of relatively easy wins on the tax front that you could look into. So things like looking at levelling up, as it were, the treatment of income from different sources, for example, because income from work is taxed much more heavily than, say, income from non-work, from property income, from shares, capital gains, that sort of thing. So there are easy wins out there in the tax system. Whether they're easy wins for a Conservative chancellor is another question.
Yeah. So Nicola, you got head of public sector in your title. So what do we think on the public sector stuff, public services? You were very vocal earlier when we were chatting before we started the broadcast. Yeah, it's kind of like, what is all this for? What does he do from here?
So a couple of things. Yes, I got head of the public sector. But I mean, yes, sorry, my brain's fried. It's been a bit of a long day. My worry is that the point about the inflationary pressures, it hits the public services you've just said, but as you know, I'm deeply into sort of the firm level micro data, and most SMEs, so 20% of SMEs last month were feeling confident about meeting payroll in April. So 20%, yeah. And that wasn't my data, it was from ACCA, the accountants, because their clients are saying to them, we can't make payroll, and everything's going through the roof. So I don't know, this is back to my frustration about a lack of a political economy which holds together, because, and I understand what everybody's been saying about the Chancellor is kind of keeping his powder dry or reserving some capacity for later. But what is he waiting for? Because every pound of growth has got to be really hard won. As we've said, the plan for growth is among the most underwhelming policy documents we've ever seen. There's nothing axiomatic about a floating up of anything in any direction, but neither for public nor private. As we all know, and this has been proven over and over again, public services that are only for the poor become poorer and poorer public services. So if no part of the equation is healthy, if growth is not being supported, if then the consequence, so Nick asks, what are the consequences for tax? I would ask, what are the consequences for growth? Because, if this sort of stagflating situation is just bad all round, isn't it? You haven't got the growth to tax. Companies don't feel anything that they would invest endogenously in their own tech or their own improvement is going in these cost of living rises and their Nick's contributions and all that. And as I say, I'm sorry, it's got a bit long-winded. You said it'd be quick, but I mean, yes, the public sector is extremely downbeat, but I wouldn't say the private sector was exactly having a party. As say, outside of tech and a few small little bubbles like that, every pound of growth is hard. And the reason that we want a buoyant private sector is in order to have a tax take worth having, in order to pay for the things that we collectively want as a society. I mean, that isn't even economics 101, that's just life 101. But the fact that a lot of those linkages appear to be broken is the broader sort of problem. And that's why it's perfectly possible for us to have a kind of, as I say, in the absence of a narrative around what is the point of getting up and going to work in whatever sector, the link between meaningful work, the right to housing, the right to family, these things have been broken. They are broken in most people's experience. So, a kind of a big reset around what it's the government's job to do, and that's why I find it frustrating when people say they're keeping their powder dry for another day. What, when the seas are over our heads? And, the point is the pandemic pulled focus. And at the same time, I would argue, was the kind of death rattle in many ways of universal healthcare free at the point of delivery, because most people are kind of exiting. And sorry, I will shut up now.
No, but I think some interesting points. There's some big worries. Again, I think it's the IFS they're looking at capacity in the health service going up, and they're particularly worried that about 6 million patients who should have attended over the last 2 years have vanished and haven't come forward.
To be honest, you're right. The vanishing part is the most worrying part. It's the same as in the economy. Where are those million workers? Where are they? Some of them are too ill now to work, but some of them are setting up businesses. There's a lot of kind of, I would like to see the government exercised about finding that stuff out, and doing something about it. But instead, they're kind of retaining capacity for another day, waiting for an electoral cycle. Frankly, we just deserve a bit better than that.
There's just a general lack of urgency. The interesting, actually, there's a few commentators they talk about saying, like, the one thing that was missing in this, and even missing in the last budget, is kind of where's the economic growth story? Is actually what is all this for?
But that's back to the plan for growth problem, because as I say, to just say that document is laughable, it's funny, but it's not bloody funny, because if you can't support sectors of the economy in places to grow, then with the best will in the world, you can't underwrite the promise of a long and healthy life. You can't. So in that case, why would you have government?
Yeah, I think these are fundamental questions. And I think on the topic of poor governance, I've managed to be terrible at chairing this and keeping this on time. So we'll come around for a last wrap up. So we've talked through lots of things that were missing and what, thingy, but, the old, well, if it had been you, stood up there on the dispatch box. And this is the moment I always hate being a panelist, because you're wondering, please don't come to me first while I think about it. But Andy's covered his eyes, so we'll go to him. What was it that was missing? There's rarely a one-stop wonder that kind of fixes this stuff, but what was the big gap that really should have been announced and wasn't?
I'm first, and I'm going to be brief again. Okay, all right. I'd say, look, I think Nicholas said it. I think the substance of what you want to do and where you want to go, and to some extent the May's lecture stuff sets that out. But we are in this very, very odd political moment. It's odd and challenging, and we understand that it's challenging. But the odd thing about it is that, as a Conservative Chancellor at least, is that you are juggling tons of things. You are putting taxes up. You are intervening in the economy left, right, and centre. And yet, at the same time, you have to present spring statements or budgets or spending reviews on the assumption that you are a tax-cutting, free market, Thatcherite Conservative. Otherwise, you don't get on the kind of on the list for any future office of state, let alone Prime Minister. So we have just this mad contradiction that creates these problems. And I think the thing that's really missing is for somebody to confront that.
So, Nick O'Donovan, how would you confront that? What's the one missing thing really yesterday? What was the big trick?
I think the big strategy is important, but I think there is a short-term squeeze on living standards that poorer households are not equipped to survive in a borderline literal sense. So I think it has to be support for poorer households was missing.
Nicola?
Yeah, 600,000 people who are on the poverty line are going to go below it, and that is that should motivate us. So just say what I would do if it was me, you know, the arsehole's view of public policy. I would stand at the dispatch box and say, we're not having any more of these fiscal events. They just mess everything up. We're going to have a smooth economic cycle that isn't politically spiked in the way that it is. If you want to know what I'm doing with the economy, you'll have to come back for drinks and nibbles at mine.
Yeah, I once worked for a chief economist, and that was always his dream. He said the Chancellor should stand up and say, there is
no more
budget,
fiscal events.
Yeah, get rid of this.
Yeah, it causes chaos. It causes chaos in the spending departments. It causes chaos in the Treasury, and it pulls focus in a way that's unhelpful.
Yeah, I think most people realise other countries really don't do it like this. This stockpiling of huge political announcements for 2
Or you could just have a flaming plan and stick to it that didn't over time, or that what your electoral cycle decouples from this ridiculousness about priming the pump to the polls to match it. It's ridiculous. It's economic vandalism.
There you go. And Craig, you get the final word. What did he miss?
I was going to say something smart about the state pension triple lock, but now everyone started talking about poverty. I feel like I'd be unkind to say that. But I mean, yeah, I think that's. I agree with Nick. Everyone remembers that catchphrase, and it's very tender on me. Like, I definitely. I think you want a chancellor. You want to live in a country where a chancellor stands up and says, "I'm not going to see hundreds of thousands of children slip into poverty, absolute poverty, on my watch, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today and do something about it." And that this isn't a left-right thing. I would have been at least somewhat cheered if he'd given us a Thatcherite vision for how we're going to boost the economy and say we're going to have growth, and that rising tide will lift all boats and they'll be trickled down. I wouldn't have agreed with that ideological perspective, but at least I would have recognised that he was trying to do something for the worst off as well as the best off. It's not how I would have approached it, but at least recognise that it was his responsibility to do something about rising poverty levels while he's in charge of the economy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a slightly more positive note on which to end. That's it. Yeah, it's just why do we not see the concrete action to tackle the actual problem that's sat directly in front of all of us? Well, as I said, I've chaired this terribly. We're 17 minutes over. But to Craig, to Nick, to Nicola, to Andy, thank you very much indeed for joining us. For all of you who've tuned in online, thanks for doing so. And we should do more events like this soon. So we'll do it once for you. See you soon. Bye-bye all.
Thank you.